So next current event I want to jump to is the new semiconductor regulations, the semiconductor export regulations that the U.S. is putting on American companies to prevent them from sending the most advanced chips that we design to China. So we did a deep dive about the chip war between U.S. and China. Please, you should go check it out.
It's so good.
Yeah.
So good.
And in October 7th, 2022, about a year ago now, the U.S. put sweeping restrictions on the exports of certain U.S. technology to design, manufacture, and the chips that we make here, and that we can't export any of that kind of stuff to China because we know how important AI specifically is going to be in military applications moving forward, and these chips are what are used to train those AI models. We don't want to let that get into China's hands, especially if it could use that kind of technology to win an invasion of Taiwan.
Right.
So the problem is, even though we had some pretty sweeping restrictions, there were still loopholes, and people have been pointing out those loopholes. So about 4 days ago, or a week ago now, there was an update to our restrictions to close some of those loopholes. Okay. Do you want to go through this, or should I start going through this?
No, I'll go through a little bit of it.
Okay.
So the issue is that U.S. companies still have an incentive to sell to China because they're profit-driven companies, right?
Mm-hmm.
Their loyalty isn't, these companies who make these chips, their loyalty isn't to America. Their loyalty isn't to the citizens of the country. Their loyalty isn't to the people who paid the tax money in order for them to do their research. Mm-hmm. And the loyalty isn't to where their institutions, their intellectual institutions, the universities that gave them all the research that they were needed to make their commercialized products. They don't have any loyalties to any of that. Their loyalty is to the dollar.
Yep.
And because of that, they're looking at China and seeing a buttload of consumers, and they're like, "Oh man, we need to do everything we can to get around these U.S. regulations because it's stifling our profits." And you have these chip companies going in, and they're trying to lobby the United States to ease these restrictions.
They've spent so much on lobbying,
and it's insane. Spend the lobbying on making more chips. Like, don't waste your money. Because we're not going to budge on this, nor should we. Mm-hmm. So now China, the United States is now requiring chip makers to obtain licenses to ship to dozens of other countries, not just China. So what was happening was chips, let's say chips were going into Vietnam. I don't know if Vietnam is one of the 12, but say chips are going to Vietnam. Those chips in Vietnam are then getting rerouted to China out of a Vietnamese company. Mm-hmm. And Vietnam doesn't have the same regulational requirement as it does to the United States, right? So now the United States is going to make chip companies get licensing for even those countries that they see as targets for possible Chinese smuggling.
Yeah. And the default position on these applications for a license is being declined. Especially for the highest end chips. So there is a little bit of, there's a difference here where there are certain thresholds that are kind of more of a dark or like a black area where these chips, you need a licensing application and they will almost certainly be denied. And then there's chips that are more in a gray area that it's like, okay, these have a little bit more leeway. If they're within certain lower thresholds, then they're more likely to have the licenses accepted.
Right. So I want to give a little explanation on like what the chip differential is, because we talk about it a lot in the deep dive, but a lot of people probably don't know that a semiconductor and a microchip is the way that we talk about effectiveness and a quality chip is how close each transistor is to each other on the chip itself. And what we've been able to do is create this massive, impressive technology that can put transistors within 1.5 nanometers in between each other. And so that's like the most high-end chip in the world. So the United States is really regulating that 3 nanometer difference to that 1.5 nanometer difference. That's what we're really regulating. We're not really regulating the 10 nanometer to 5 nanometer. That's not really where we're concerned about. It's like it's that sub 5, sub 3 level that we're concerned about.
Yeah. Exactly.
Because that's what has the high computational power.
Yeah. Now, after our initial restrictions came out, NVIDIA specifically came out with a chip that was able to do very close to the performance of the band chips. And it was able to do that because we had two variables that we put thresholds on to say that chips couldn't be exported, okay? And they were a bandwidth requirement and a performance speed requirement. So bandwidth is how fast chips can talk to each other, whereas performance speed is how fast the singular chip works on its own. Because of that, right, the new chip that NVIDIA made would still be really fast on its own and just be just under that bandwidth requirement. So it was still very useful for companies, especially in AI applications. What we've done now is removed that bandwidth threshold. So it's just based on performance speed, and there's no way around this. We even added another requirement called a performance density threshold, because a potential workaround would be getting a bunch of these chips that are just under our performance speed threshold and wiring them together so that together in network, they can get up to really high performances. This performance density threshold means that's not allowed either. So really, there is no way that an NVIDIA, an AMD, or an Intel can put out a new chip that still is within the restriction thresholds that have been announced and really have a similar type of computing power as the highest end chips.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. It's crazy the lengths that these companies are going to try to get their products in that market.
Yeah.
You know?
Profit motive, man.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
It's crazy. We always say, like, when the profit motive is not aligned to socially good behavior, it is the most dangerous.
Yeah.
It is the most dangerous thing in the world.
That is when you need government intervention.
Yeah.
That is the point. Yeah. So the question now is what happens with Chinese American relations? And obviously, the Chinese didn't like this.
No. No, they did not.
We've been normalizing a little bit with China recently. Things have been cooling off as we've had several American envoys go there, right, for conversations.
Mm-hmm. We have a meeting with them next month in California.
Oh.
We have a big Asian summit in California where it looks like Xi is going to be attending, which is going to be big.
And meeting with Biden.
Right. Which is going to be huge.
Yeah. As long as they don't blow it up.
As long as the world doesn't blow up by then, which we'll talk about. But now we're thinking, like, could this chip strategy backfire? Mm-hmm. Are we pushing the Chinese to now create that technology that much faster than what they would have? So there was an example of this recently. Huawei released a new phone, and it is to date the best chip that China has yet produced. Mm-hmm. U.S. analysts are a little conflicted on what this means. Some people say, oh man, this means China is increasing their production capacity and they're improving. But other U.S. analysts have suggested that the achievement still most likely hinges on American technology and machinery that they go in violation of the U.S. trade restrictions.
Well, I think either in violation or that they hoarded before the restrictions went into effect.
It's either they had it in their vault ready to go, mm-hmm. or they got it through a violation of the restriction. If it's in their vault, I'm not worried about it because these machines break and they need to be serviced, and nobody is going to come and service them in China. It's not going to happen. So I'm not really worried about that if it's in their vault because it'll run out eventually. I am worried if they're getting rid of the trade restrictions to get the machinery.
Yeah. Yes. I agree. But I think these new restrictions then would help with that a lot.
Yes, these new restrictions are going to help a lot. Mm-hmm. Tech Insights, which is a Canadian firm that analyzes everything that has to do with semiconductors, they concluded that the advanced chip was manufactured by Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corporation of China. So this is the state-owned company, the SMIC. That they say they were operating beyond the technology limits that the United States has been trying to enforce. Yeah. So this is nerve-wracking because, again, either they hoarded it or they got it through a trade restriction or they built it themselves. But, again, U.S. analysts say they didn't probably build them themselves. It's probably U.S. machinery. Yeah. Right.
It was a big deal. Like, when the phone hit the market, people were like, whoa, this is way better than we expected they would be able to do. Yeah. So I mean, props to the Chinese for being able to get around that. It is impressive, but I don't think it will be able to continue unabated.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But now this is when it gets tricky now, because are NVIDIA, AMD, and Intel going to go back to the Biden administration and say, hey, look, they have this 8 out of 10 chip. Can we sell our 8 out of 10 chips too now? Like, oh, look, China already has this good chip. Can we sell them our like that level good chips too?
Yeah.
Right? And then every implement that China does that gets higher and higher, these companies are going to keep coming back to the Biden administration saying, oh, look, they already have it anyway. It's not like we're giving it to them.
I suppose, but I think I honestly trust in the competence of the Biden administration. And they have leverage over these companies because of the incentives they've put out in the Chips and Science Act.
True.
Right? They've already signed up on board. They've planned to get all this money to put these new fabs here. And we've talked about, when we did that deep dive, the how part of the legislation includes the ability for the government to claw back that money if it's not used for the purposes set out in the applications.
That's totally true. And
So-
the companies do not want to be paying back the federal government after taking these subsidies out. Absolutely not.
Totally.
But now, Ben,
Yeah.
China is responding, and pretty aggressively.
Yeah. The response was quick. And I think that the timeliness as far as what we've been putting out recently is kind of hilarious, because we just did a deep dive on our last episode about the transition to electric vehicles. We talked all about how China really dominates the supply chain all the way up and down it for that process. A big part of it including the mining, processing, and refining of some of the most important metals that go into EV batteries. One of those metals is graphite, okay? China produces 65% of the world's graphite and refines more than 90% of it.
Oh, no.
Okay? And in response to these new chip restrictions, China has restricted its graphite exports.
Now, graphite is vital to the production of electric vehicles. It is used in almost all EV battery anodes. Okay, this is essential. And we're talking about the country has 90% of the world's refining capacity.
Yeah. The refining capacity is the one thing I'm concerned about.
But that's the thing that can be created elsewhere, right?
Yes, but it'll take time.
Yeah,
I
it takes time.
think.
It takes time.
I wasn't able to find like where else refining is really done. It is so dominated by China. I think, but though in the immediate future, kind of just like China found ways around our chips restrictions, I think we'll act quickly, and our auto manufacturers will act quickly to make sure this isn't crippling to them, right? In the immediate future, I think there's going to be a spike in buying before the Chinese restrictions go into effect. And then you're going to see existing producers spike in production, startup producers of graphite, producers and refiners in other countries. We're going to see more investment, and they're going to be able to hopefully ramp up, scale up. I think it's not going to be crippling. It might be slowing things down. But what we saw with China restricting exports of these other materials a few months ago, germanium and gallium, which was kind of a delayed response to the first chip restrictions that we put on them. What happened was, first their exports went down to almost nothing.
Yeah.
And then as they decided, we want the income from these natural resources, they gave out more and more licenses, so it wasn't as much of a problem, and people had access to them. I expect something really similar to happen here.
Like, because we saw a massive decrease in Chinese exports over the last year. That's another one of the themes that we've had on the show.
Yeah.
We were covering very frequently the export and import levels of Chinese economy, and it's been really bad for China. You can see the decoupling in the United States, which was their biggest trading partner. And so now, if you're going to cut your exports again, are all of your Chinese companies going to be able to gobble up all this refined graphite? I don't think so. And so this is going to be sitting on a lot of graphite that now needs to be put somewhere in order to make back the money that was invested to refine it.
Yeah.
And I don't know how long that can hold. It kind of reminds me of the Russia situation, where Russia restricted its petroleum exports for a while, did it for like 2 weeks. It crippled their economy, and then they lifted the restriction like 2 days later.
Yeah.
And so it kind of strikes me like that. I feel like it's a little easier for the United States because our economy isn't relying on it. right?
Sure.
Where if China, this could hit them harder.
I think it could. For what it's worth, they do have extremely high graphite demands in their own country. Like we talked about last week, China's EV industry is more advanced by far than any other country in the world.
Yeah.
And it's growing faster than any other country. So it does have a lot of batteries to make itself, but it still will be in its interest to mine and ship out more graphite. So hopefully not the end of the world in the near term.
Yeah.
Yeah.